Welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse. I'm recording this episode following the Orioles' excruciating 3-2 loss to the Atlanta Braves, a series where there was definitely more opportunity there for the Orioles to win more than a game of the three. With that said, the Orioles did drop 2 out of 3, although that is not going to be the focus of the discussion today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that is slightly outdated at this point. I'm going to be talking about the Orioles extension with Kyle Bradish to this 5-year deal worth a total of $90 million across those 5 years. So, uh, this is a pretty significant move for the Orioles. It really makes a big deal and will have kind of a big impact on the long-term outlook of this organization. I know that there has been, I think the one thing that we could kind of look to with this move is that the Orioles are sort of planning maybe to varying levels or varying degrees across the next 5, 7 years. But the Orioles are looking to compete through the next 5 to 7 years. There has been speculation a bit, given the really poor performances that the Orioles have had last year, have had this year, of the Orioles maybe trying to do a rebuild or some thought of a partial rebuild, etc. And maybe that will happen if the GMs end up changing or Michael Elias is no longer here. Um, but in this move, there's of course the approval that has been provided by David Rubenstein. So it at least seems as if the Orioles are mentally planning to just sort of compete going forward. I think that although this is I'll talk a little bit about sort of the evenness or the fairness of this agreement. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I think that the Orioles have really, um, you know, if the Orioles were not competing and were going to try to do something resembling a rebuild here, Kyle Bradish would have been one of the best pieces. And I don't mean this at this deadline necessarily, but this would Kyle Bradish would have been one of their pieces that would have been the most widely desirable and probably would have gotten a really big return in terms of prospects and things like that had the Orioles not given him this extension. Now, of course, the Orioles could trade him theoretically. There's no trade clause. But of course, because of this long-term extension and a team either having to probably absorb the remainder of the contract money-wise if he ever were to get dealt, and I don't think that's likely, but if he were to get dealt and this other team had to absorb the contract that's built in, that of course is going to be what the payment is. The Orioles are off the hook for this money, or at least the majority of the payment. And this other team, they might give up a prospect or two, but the bulk of it would be paying this contract out. And the Orioles' benefit in trading Kyle Bradish away um, would predominantly be being able to alleviate themselves of that contract if they were in a situation where they were not contending. So, of course, this kind of shows and demonstrates that that is not in the plan for the Orioles, and they're sort of undeterred by what they've seen for at a bare minimum the last year and a half, but we could even stretch that to the last couple years if we're going back another half season or so. So yeah, so if we're kind of looking at this agreement, um I would say it's a rather aggressive move by the Orioles to try to do this and try to make this happen. Not that it's a bad move. I think that like I said, I'll talk about kind of how each side of this agreement makes out, but um, yeah, it's definitely sort of a more aggressive move, and I think that it kind of shows that the Orioles are not trying to maybe do what would need to be done to sort of fix the structural holes in this organization. Maybe they think that we just do a few things here, a few things there, shore up a couple things here, make it a quick addition here, etc. Even if not this year, more or less long term, they will, next year or the following year, they believe themselves to be in a position to make the playoffs, and I would imagine, ultimately win the World Series. I mean, that is ultimately the goal. And, I guess, a lot of teams maybe have philosophies that, we're just going to try to make the playoffs and then, whatever, we'll see what happens at that point. But yeah, definitely the Orioles, I think, are viewing themselves as a contender. I think that also potentially provides some insight as to what the Orioles will do this deadline. I know that, there's a lot of discussion about how, these few games will have significant impacts on what the Orioles decide to do. This upcoming series against the Tigers will, really make, or have an outsized impact on, how the Orioles approach the deadline. I'm not actually sure that's true. I think that Elias might be, of course, trying to hide his cards a little bit. But I think at this point in the season, with July almost coming to a close, the Orioles, need to sort of know what their approach is, and not only know what their approach is, but also, what do they make of this team, right? Whether this team wins two out of the next three or loses two out of the next three should not have that much impact on, the entire outlook and the entire direction of the organization and the team this year. And, they're going to be making moves that impact next year as well. So, it should not be a situation where it comes down to a series against the Tigers or a series against the Braves and the Tigers. They should have some sense of direction. But I think if we're looking at this move, it does kind of show that, you know, um, they imagine themselves being competitive, over the course of the next few years, not just tanking the next couple years and trying to rebuild. So I think, the outcome of that is that, if they imagine themselves, trying to compete in, the next few years, I think that they're unlikely to sacrifice this year to try to put themselves in position for the next couple years. I think that, probably not to say that this is what I would do, but I think they're probably feeling like they are in the situation where we're close enough and, we have the talent. And, even though this defense looks atrocious, we're just gonna try to make it happen and see what we can do. So this 5-year extension covers the next 2 years of his arbitration years. So he's going to earn 10 million next season, and then he's going to have the 13 million the following season after that. So those are going to be his final two arbitration years. Technically, those are going to be bought out. And then there's this 3-year extension on top of those two arbitration years with 17 million, 22 million, and 28 million in the following years. So it's always pretty standard for the salary increases they're not going to be evenly distributed over each of the years, and they're going to be gradually increasing. That's always a bit of a benefit for the organization. A lot of teams, organizations, of course, they like deferred money. paying in the future, not paying right now. So that is very common all the time. And yeah, he's gonna so those are kind of the figures. And of course, as I said before, the total is gonna be 90 million over the entire 5 years. Um, we could sort of think about it though as yes, it's a 5 year extension. It's also kind of just a 3 year extension because we're getting him only 3 more years beyond, the time that we were already going to have him. So, um, yeah, the extension terminology is always kind of strange when it's covering the arbitration years because, this is being described as a 5 year extension. Although 2 of those years he was definitely in general or definitely barring trade going to be an Oriole. So, all right. So yeah, so basically, I guess the big part of this is kind of, is there kind of a clear winner and loser in this arrangement? And I'm actually sort of happy to say that I don't think so. I think this is you know, if it works out according to both sides, I think it's probably a mutually beneficial trade and mutually beneficial agreement. I don't think that the Orioles, quote unquote, way overpaid for Kyle Bradish, and I don't think Kyle Bradish did, sort of way worse than he could have had he just kind of gone into free agency and just tested the market fully. So it's not exactly clear for Kyle Bradish. Of course, the big benefit of this is, if he was, of course, healthy and a very, very good pitcher over the next 2 years. Um, going into free agency, he would probably make much more, or at least a bit more than he's making on this contract. However, with that said, there is also, the risk he's had a good amount of injury issues throughout the course of his career. And I think that that is sort of enough for him to be concerned. He's also a guy who he's currently 29, so he would have hit free agency at 31, and he is sort of in the unfortunate position to be one of the sort of late bloomers in Major League Baseball. um, there is so much, hopefully this will change in the upcoming negotiations and the CBA. But so much of your earning power over the course of your career is determined by what age you become a Major League Baseball player, because that's when your clock starts ticking for when you can hit free agency. So, of course, guys like Juan Soto, even Jackson Holiday, are in much, much better position. Samuel Basallo is are in much better position to earn a larger amount of money over the course of their career. Um, than somebody like Bradish, who started his career a bit later, and plenty of other guys in Major League Baseball who start their careers later and then end up, sort of in this position like Bradish is, where, the first time he's going to become a free agent, prior to this agreement would have been 31. And, you know, probably his best years of pitching are behind him. He's open to risk for arm injury, etc. So, of course, I think ideally, in an ideal, sort of fair situation, he would have become a major leaguer. He would have become a major league free agent at a younger age than he would be. But given that this is sort of the situation for him, I think it's a pretty fair agreement all around. The Orioles are potentially absorbing some risk given his injury history. Although I think to do this move, they have to feel pretty confident about kind of where he's at injury wise. So I think maybe that's not as much of a concern for them. Um, Yeah, but this is the largest contract that has ever been given out to a pitcher by the Orioles. So they've already blown past Shane Baz's contract, which was previously before this deal the largest contract the Orioles had signed a pitcher to. I think, kind of in hindsight, it does kind of show that, either things are different in Baltimore if the Orioles were looking into guys like Valdez and Suarez, and, they're contemplating this $100 million range contracts for pitchers. Um, that is a very different situation than where the Orioles have been historically. Of course, some of that is due to inflation and just sort of, um, you know, players making more than they used to in the past. So there's some of that. But also, there's either also an additional change of mentality among ownership that is sort of factoring into that as well. So, as far as the Orioles, like, Kyle Bradish has been the, you know, the basically the ace for the Orioles over the last few years. If we're sort of thinking about it from like a long-term perspective, he of course, pitched game one in the ALDS for us when the Orioles went against the Texas Rangers and lost that series. But he was the game one starter in that series. So he's kind of had the role of being our ace for a while now, and so it's fitting and it's good for the Orioles to try to keep him here, and it's I always sort of make a big deal about this. He did start off with the Angels, but Kyle Bradish has an opportunity to sort of be maybe something similar to what Adam Jones was, right? Adam Jones did technically start his career with the Mariners, and he did technically, although he did end his career with the Diamondbacks. But with that said, like basically, he was very, very close to being an all-time Oriole, and Kyle Bradish could have an opportunity to do that. So, I think this is, I think it's a really exciting move, of course. I think the fans, of course, should be excited about this. Um, you know, there is maybe some indication that uh, the Orioles are going to be more willing to spend, which is always a great sign and a great indication. Um, the I think that the Orioles, given sort of where they're at with things, I don't think this impacts their ability to, extend other guys on the team. Adley Rutschman, maybe it impacts a bit. I think that. Um, I think he's sort of unlikely to remain with the Orioles after he hits free agency, especially with Basayo. I'm just kind of not sure it makes sense for either side. He's the one that's really impacted. Gunnar Henderson might also a little bit be impacted as well. He's a bit further than Adley is from free agency, so he might be a bit impacted as well, although I mean, maybe it is more of a conversation because of how bad he's been this year. He might also be one of those guys where, this contract, he's going to make so much money when he hits free agency that, the amount of money spent on this contract will be close to negligible from the Orioles' perspective and won't really impact one way or another whether he gets re-signed. So, I think that there are a lot of positives to this. The only thing, and we will continue to have this conversation as we approach the deadline and stuff. The only downside from potentially an Orioles or an Oriole fan or an Oriole organization perspective is kind of if you have the view that, things need to sort of be torn down and rebuilt a little bit more, then this move would be a little probably frustrating if you're of that perspective. But they already have Pete Alonso here for the next 5 years anyway. Is it really detracting from their vision of sort of where they were heading anyway, regardless? So, no, definitely an exciting move. Yeah, I guess, yeah, he's just probably not much of a trade candidate at this point. And, the Orioles won't be getting many prospects for him. And there is, of course, need at this point, given sort of where the Orioles are at to sort of replenish the farm system. But that will not be done at the expense of Kyle Bradish's future in Baltimore. So hopefully it's something that fans are really excited about. I think that definitely it's an exciting move. It's exciting anytime that the Orioles can kind of keep our guys, right? I mean, I think that as fans, we want continuity. We don't want to be the Rays who, we fall in love with a player and then they trade them, for, 2 years before their contract expires, or make no efforts to, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, extend guys and stuff like that. So, from that perspective, it's exciting. Hopefully, it's encouraging about, the direction of where the Orioles will go. The cost cutting and the sort of cheap version of Michael Elias that we saw at the beginning of his time here in Baltimore. Of course, it's different situations, where he was at then as opposed to now. But nonetheless, potentially, we're not going to see that sort of cheap version, the cost cutting version of Michael Elias for the remainder of the time he's here, if he is here beyond the season. So, all encouraging to see. All right, everybody, that will wrap it up for this show. Thank you all so much for listening. If you want to follow us, you can follow us at the Warehouse Pod on Blue Sky. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us, thewarehousepod@gmail.com. And yeah, definitely. We will be watching as the Orioles approach this deadline and these next few critical games against Detroit. Thank you all so much for listening, everybody. My name is Jesse. This has been the Warehouse Podcast, and go O's.